Hello, students, and welcome to Mr. Brandes' second podcast on evolution. In this podcast, we're going to be discussing the voyage of the Beagle, Darwin's theory of natural selection, as well as descent with modification, as well as people who actually influenced Darwin while developing his primary theory of evolution. So Darwin was the individual who developed this theory, and Darwin's ideas provided the framework for our understanding of Earth's diversity, as well as how organisms react with one another and their environments. In 1831, Darwin set off. He was only 22 years old at this time. Darwin set off on the HMS Beagle, which stands for Her Majesty's Ship. And this was a voyage not for discovering evolution, but the actual voyage was to help map out the lower part of the globe because it was very much uncharted waters at that time. So during Darwin's voyage, he noticed a great deal of diversity, especially when he got to the Galapagos Islands. He noticed a variety of creatures living together, everything from iguanas and birds and tortoise and a variety of other creatures that forced him to kind of come up with an idea as to how they would all get there and be living there at the same time. Individuals who influenced Darwin: George Buffon, who lived from 1707 to 1788, and he was one of the first individuals to say, you know what, Earth might be older than a few thousand years, which is the common thinking back then. He also stated that structures of organisms of the past were also very similar to the structures that we see in organisms today. Lamarck, from 1744 to 1829, he thought adaptation was gained through the use of a certain trait. So, for example, a giraffe's neck got tall because it had to reach high into the branches, and with every generation of giraffe, they would have to get taller and taller necks in order to get those leaves from the very tops of the trees. That's not true because we now know adaptations are inherited and they don't happen because they have to. So that's where Lamarck was off, but laid the foundation to say that different creatures have adaptations that have changed over time. Charles Lyell, he was a geologist, and he was able to put together how geologic events can actually change the way our land looks. And this is very important because obviously things don't stay constant. We have changes in land like floods, we have rivers running dry, we have changes in climate. All those natural events cause changes within those populations. Thomas Malthus was a reverend. He lived from 1766 to 1834. And he thought that the human population could actually grow faster than they could make food and other resources. So food and resources could be seen as a limiting agent, something that will determine a population's growth. A lot of individuals say because we have about a little over 7 billion people on the planet, it's going to be harder and harder and harder to feed everyone if we keep on growing, unless our technology gets a lot better. So those were the four individuals who really helped Darwin in his thinking. So Darwin wasn't the only one to come up with the primary theory of evolution. In 1858, another British naturalist called Alfred Wallace came to the same conclusion. Darwin was shocked to actually receive a letter from him because he had heard about the work that he was doing and the book that he was trying to write, and they jointly presented their work to the public. And then a year later, Darwin published his book entitled The Origin of Species. Darwin had two major points that he took away from his voyage on the Beagle. He said that descent with modification was a process by which descendants of ancestral organisms spread into various habitats and accumulated adaptations to diverse ways of life. The human race is a very good example. A long time ago, we believe that our ancestors originated from Africa, and they had a very dark skin tone, and their skin tone was to help protect them from the sun, right? That melanin, which is giving them that type of skin tone, allows them to not have as many mutations and protects them in a variety of ways. As the human population grew out of Africa and went up into the northern regions where there was far less light, we accumulated different adaptations, one of which being a lighter skin tone. And so that way we can actually absorb those vitamins from the sun, like vitamin D3. And for a variety of other reasons, our skin tone became lighter because it was more advantageous to us. The other main point was natural selection. And natural selection is a process by which individuals with inherited characteristics, well suited to their environment, leave behind more offspring than others. Or the use of antibacterial soap is a great example of this. Some bacteria actually have a gene inside of them that will allow them to be immune to a specific antibiotic. So if you put that antibiotic on your hands, the only germs that will die are the non-resistant ones. And therefore, the only ones left are the healthy individuals who are resistant to that antibiotic, and they go and procreate. They undergo binary fission, and eventually you're left with bacteria that are immune to that antibiotic. This is obviously a really bad thing because we only have a finite amount of antibiotics in the world. And so the same thing is true with pesticides, fungicides, or herbicides. Various creatures have these genes that will allow them to survive that cataclysmic event of being sprayed by a pesticide or herbicide or antibiotic. So natural selection and descent with modification are Darwin's two major points that he made in his book. So to continue on, in biology, a population is considered a group of individuals of the same species living in the same area at the same time. So let's put descent with modification and natural selection together. Let's say a group of animals, let's say finches, decide to go colonize a chain of islands off the coast, and each island has slightly different fruit and climate and geographic area. You would begin to see that these groups of birds would become very different over time, especially if they were accustomed to staying on one particular island versus another. And over many generations, these populations could become very different and eventually become separate species. And that's kind of the idea behind Darwin's theory of evolution, as he said, creatures will reproduce generation after generation and adapt to their environments because natural selection will select for those traits. And eventually, you can have creatures become separate species. So there are three types of evolution that I want you to know. Divergent, in which the same species will evolve into two separate species. Parallel, which is the species as a whole goes into a separate species. Convergent evolution is a process by which two distinct lineages evolve similar characteristics independently of one another. This often occurs because lineages face similar environmental challenges and selective pressures. So you'll notice that some of these individuals have a very large beak. And this is true for other birds on that island. They have also developed different beak sizes as well because they were under the same selective pressures. So that's an example of convergent evolution. Evidence of evolution. This is how we know allele frequencies have been changing over time, from generation to generation. There are four main categories of evolutionary evidence: fossils, geographic distribution, similarities in structure, developmental biology, as well as molecular biology, all point to evolution as being a cause for new species coming about. First off, fossils. So the positions in the fossil rock strata can actually give you a relative age of that fossil. So here we see a fossil deeper in the ground and then a fossil over here which is a little bit higher in the ground, and this indicates that this lower fossil will be older than the newer fossil. And we can also take a look at things like bone structure, and the Basilosaurus was originally a four-legged creature, and you can tell this because of the foot bones that it actually has, and we'll talk about that a little bit later because you see those in modern-day whales. That's called a vestigial structure, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds. So biogeography is where certain creatures are in the world, so where they are living. And when you think of Australia, you think of kangaroos, koalas, all those cute and cuddly creatures, and they are all marsupials. And this indicates that we have a marsupial ancestor living on that island of Australia, and they lived there for quite some time, and they were all able to evolve without any placental mammals like deer or squirrels or anything else like that. And the reason why they have some of those creatures there now is because humans have actually brought them over. The hypothesis is Australia's diverse marsupial species evolved from marsupial ancestors on an island continent that was isolated from placental mammals. Similarities in structure is also known as comparative anatomy, and this is comparing different bodily structures to see if they have any evidence of a link between them. And as we see here, we have a human arm, a cat's leg, a whale's fin, and a bat's arm, and they're all made of the same bones. Now, obviously, they're slightly different sizes. Some are elongated, some are shorter and fatter. But they are all made of the same bones, which means or indicates that we have also shared a common ancestor with those same creatures. Now, this is different than analogous structures. So we have homologous structures and we have analogous structures. And analogous structures are structures like a bird's wing and a bee's wing. Obviously, they are very different, but some people think that they are the same because they both give flight to that creature. And that's not the case. They don't have a common ancestor, right? The bee's wings came from an ancestral insect, while the bird's wings came from an ancestral bird. And so they are very different. And those are called analogous structures. They're structures that may give you the same ability, but they are not inherited from the same common ancestors. Vestigial structures are structures that may have had a use in prehistoric time or from another generation of creatures, but it doesn't have any clear use today. Some people would argue for the humans' wisdom teeth and the appendix are vestigial structures because we don't actually use them as much as we have in the past. So a vestigial structure example of another creature would be in whales. They have a hind leg bone that you actually cannot see from the outside of the whale. It's actually tucked inside them, and it has no use whatsoever. But if you can recall all the way back to the Basilosaurus here, that Basilosaurus had that hind leg, and it was fully developed with those bones and used as a fin to propel itself through the water. But here we see in modern day that bone is actually not used anymore. So we can use anatomy to say, okay, this creature had this, and this creature had this, and this creature had this, and therefore they are all related in some way, shape, or form. There are two different things that I want you to take away from that, and that is homology are traits inherited from two different organisms from a common ancestor. Analogy is similarity due to convergent evolution and not common ancestry. So if we take a look here, these are the skull bones of different creatures of the past and the iguana, which is a creature found nowadays. And they all have very similar bone structures. Obviously, they have changed over time, but they are still very similar. You see this all throughout a variety of creatures, including birds' wings and, arms of dinosaurs as well. They are very similar in structure. Developmental biology is really cool, and it provides us with a fair amount of evidence for evolution. Basically, what we see is similar embryos between related species. Now, as you can see here, we're all the mammals over here, and if you go back far enough in our development when we're inside of our mothers, we all look remarkably similar to one another. And then as we develop, we obviously become very different. Same is true for some of our reptilian friends here. They all look very similar in comparison, and then as they develop differently. And even turtles and lizards all start off with a beak-like structure to help them push through their eggs when they're emerging. And so that goes away eventually. So embryos of closely related organisms often have similar stages in development. And then finally, probably one of the most important aspects of our evidence of evolution is molecular biology. We see that if two species have genes and proteins with sequences that match closely, we can conclude that the sequences must have been inherited from a relatively recent common ancestor. And so we can go back, and we've done this with humans as well. We've taken a look at our mitochondria and tracked it all the way back from where we are today, all the way back to Africa, which is very, very cool. And you can track and trace those genes from generation to generation and see how they can slightly change. And here we have an example of the mouse PAX6 gene. And if we take a look at other creatures, right, like the fly or the shark or the squid or the flatworm, and we can see how these genes are similar, and all the highlighted regions that you see are the exact same as that mouse's gene. And so here we see the genetic similarity to the mouse is about 76.66%, and the protein is exactly the same. Same thing is true for the shark's eye. Here we have 85% homology and 100% protein similarity. And again, squid eye is 100% same protein and 78.3% for the actual gene. And so we can say that this gene was passed on from an ancestral organism to the modern day organisms. And that concludes our evidence for evolution. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them down, and I will talk about them in class tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.